I wrote the book because I was struck that nobody in the world of business was talking about something that seems so fundamental to me. I spent most of my career in the luxury goods world, and it goes without saying that great luxury brands wouldn't exist if they didn't have extraordinary aesthetic content. But more and more, I saw that other brands and other industries could use a lot more aesthetics than they were tapping into. And for a long time, I would say for 100+ years, companies that were in areas like automotive and heavy industry and pharmaceutical and technology didn't have to worry about such things. They could compete and win on speed, on technology or innovation, on size. But we've kind of gotten to this weird inflection point in human history where that's no longer a competitive advantage. Where robotics, can basically commoditize all of those features, and it's a great race to the bottom. And so I kept wondering why some of these practices and talents that I saw around me throughout my career didn't find their way into these other businesses where they really could be a sustainable competitive advantage. Well, I would argue AI, or aesthetic intelligence, which I refer to as the other AI, is important to all industries. But the reason that retail will benefit in particular is because so much of retail is inessential. When you think about why people buy, with the exception of a few categories like bread and oil and gas, to fill up your car, the vast majority of what we spend money on, we just don't need. We don't need another t-shirt. We don't need another bag of potato chips. We don't need another lipstick. But what we do need, the collective we, is to enjoy our life, to surround our things with with objects and experiences that feel beautiful, that make us feel alive, that express who we are, that connect us with other people who share our tastes and our preferences. And that's the only reason that retail still exists. If it's just for satisfying functional needs, then game over. Amazon will account for 100% of our shopping needs. But when I walk into a store, I'm really looking for more than just to satisfy my functional need. I am looking for an experience. I'm looking to discover something unexpected. I'm looking for inspiration. And AI is so critical to all of those elements. So the halo effect is a really important concept, and it doesn't just apply to aesthetics, but it is very much a part of the aesthetic experience. The halo effect states that about 50% of the value of any given product or service is enjoyed. The value is actually experienced at the point of purchase or at the moment of usage. And the other 50% actually has nothing to do with what happens in the store or what happens when you're engaging with the product, but it has to do with the memory of when you used it or experienced it and the anticipation of doing so again. That's a good 50% of the value. And most marketers and most entrepreneurs don't really think about the human experience outside of that direct interaction. One of the best examples I can think of, and this is really in the history of business, of a company that is so masterful at creating a halo effect to the point where I would say the halo is more valuable than the actual experience at that point of sale, is Walt Disney. When I think of Walt Disney, when I think of the experience of going to those parks, there's a lot of elements to it that are quite unappealing. First of all, if you're going to Orlando in the summer, that in and of itself is unappealing. The lines are very long, it's full of people. It's expensive. I mean, for the average American family or non-American family, it's a lot of money to spend a few days at those parks. And when I think of the enjoyment factor, clearly when you're actually on the ride or when you're kind of taking in the sights, there's a lot of thrill, especially through the eyes of young kids. But where the real thrill seems to kick in is those 6 or 4 weeks before you get on the airplane to go to Disney World, and how excited everyone is, and the decision of what you're going to bring, and the research of what rides you're going to start with, and how you're going to spend each of those days that you have. And then the memory, the fact that maybe 6 months or 1 year or 3 years after, that you're still looking back on pictures and remembering your summer vacation at Disney World in 1999. And I would say that the memory and the anticipation around Disney is so powerful that it keeps people coming back year after year after year. And it is very hard in the experience world to keep people coming back in that way. Well, people often ask me, can aesthetics be learned, or is it just something you're born with? similar as the aesthetic intelligence I use interchangeably with taste, good taste. And I always say it definitively can be developed. Some people come into this world with advantages, and some people come in this world with hurdles. I will probably never be as fine a chef, no matter how hard I try, as a Daniel Boulud, or as good a fragrance maker as a Jo Malone, or Estee Lauder was in her time. They had an extraordinary ability to smell different essences and notes that elude me. But I can tell you with great confidence that if I decided I wanted to be a lot better as a nose, as they call them in the industry, or as a chef, even if it was for recreational purpose, that with the right practice and the right attention, I would get better. So the question is, how do you get better? And like any exercise you do, it takes time, it takes discipline, it takes patience, it takes a certain constancy, and it also can atrophy like any muscle development if you don't keep it up. The first step of good taste is what I call attunement. If you're not highly aware of the stimuli you're getting, the visual stimuli, aromatic stimuli, and so forth, you won't be able to do anything with it. And we live in a world where we are trained to block. We numb ourselves all the time. And we have to unnumb ourselves in order to start the process. But it doesn't end there. The second step is what I call interpretation. You have to learn not just to be able to detect and decipher these different sensorial cues, but have an appreciation for how it makes you feel. Does it make you feel happy? Does it make you feel excited? Does it make you feel horrified? Whatever the emotion is, the more you can connect the sensorial experience with the emotional response, that's a powerful next step. The third is what I call curation. So the power of curation, and it's often where people get stuck, I think, in this process, is let's go back to the chef analogy. If you're making a great meal, the last thing you would want to do is take your 10 or 15 favorite ingredients and just put them in a pot together. It isn't about putting all these great individual elements together. Curation is about how they work as a whole. And it takes a lot of editorial command. It takes a lot of restraint in order to take things that are good but are not value add out of the pot. And so that's true, I think, when it comes to the way people dress, which come with interior design and with brand development. And when you're creating a brand, just because you like the color pink and you like the color orange doesn't mean you put them together and in all places within your various brand messages. So this command and what I call editorial control is a very important third step. The last step, and this one is particularly important for business, less so when it comes to just developing personal taste, is what I call articulation. So it's one thing to know with great precision what feels and looks good to you as an individual and how to maybe recreate that in the context of your own space. But if you're leading a company or even a team and you want them to move toward your vision, if you can't articulate with precision and specificity and power what it is that not only looks and feels good to you, but how they can deliver on it, then you will not be able to scale it. And that really was the ultimate genius of a Steve Jobs. Steve was not a craftsman. He wasn't an artist. He never really studied design. He took a semester of calligraphy. That's, as far as I know, it. But the fact that he could mobilize thousands and thousands of people at Apple toward a vision that was so supremely good to him, that was his talent. He was an aesthetic genius. A lot of brands have their moment in the sun. A great brand is able to sustain itself by this very delicate balance of honoring its heritage and maintaining its relevance and sense of modernity. So I think there are quite a few examples, although their graveyard is full with more examples of brands that have not modernized and not been able to stay relevant. One such brand that I had a direct experience with is Louis Vuitton. If you think about Vuitton, there's no reason in 2020 that it is still a coveted brand. It was founded in the mid-1800s by a carpenter named Mr. Vuitton, whose big innovation at the time was he created a trunk for people traveling on steamship engines, or steam engine ships, I guess they're called. But he developed a trunk that, relative to its predecessors, which was made out of wood, actually was fairly impenetrable to the water. So you'd be on a boat if you're coming abroad or to the continent. You would be on a boat for weeks or maybe months on end. So you wanted something that would withstand the elements, and you also wanted something that was fairly lightweight because you might be stacking a couple of trunks. And he used this treated canvas that they still use today. Everything before that was wood, so it was rather heavy and cumbersome. So you sort of flash forward now to 2020. Nobody travels with a trunk. The handful of trunks that still exist are usually used for coffee tables and for effect at that. But the idea that continues to drive all these decades later, the Vuitton brand, is this thrill of adventure, of global travel, of visiting the exotic new worlds, whether it's Mongolia or Paris, or Arizona, wherever people are going. And you'll notice that in the stores, they don't do it in a very overt way, but there are constant cues to the fact that this is an adventure brand and that it still stands for the values of global travel and sort of cultivating yourself through the exotica of visiting new places. And so that the idea behind Vuitton is as relevant today as it was in the 1850s. How it expresses itself through products, through store representation, through its campaigns, obviously has taken on a very different twist. What people forget, because they assume that there was sort of a continual, right? But there was a period from those mid-1800s, and let's just say after the steamship kind of faded away, probably in the 1920s to 1970s, that Vuitton barely existed. When Christian Dior died in the 50s, the brand was basically latent, it went asleep. And part of Arnault and others at LVMH, their genius is they took these sleeping concepts and brought them back to life. I always say if there's tension between the analytics and the quantitative reasoning and between the inspired, creative, imaginative side of what we do, that's healthy. If there's no tension, I worry, because we're talking business. We're not talking art, and we're not talking robotics. We're talking business that fall along the spectrum and often meet in the middle. When I think of aesthetic intelligence, I always say it doesn't supplant the importance of data. And data can be very powerful, but data and data analysis are not strategies, and you're certainly not going to win. There's going to be someone else, and it probably isn't even a human being. It probably will be robotic that will get there much sooner and much cheaper, and always stay a few steps ahead. There are certain things, though, that machines cannot do. And there are not too many, by the way. There are fewer and fewer, but there are some things that the machines cannot do, and I would say in my lifetime probably won't. And one of them is exercise great taste. And by taste, I don't mean symmetry. I don't mean the kind of classic, is it pleasant to look at? I do think that they can replicate art, and there's certain things machines will do that will close the gap. But great taste to me has this human element behind it that is as much as anything about surprise, about combining ideas and maybe even sensorial cues that we are unexpected or that we are not accustomed to seeing together, and doing it in a very original and inspired way. There's also a lot of aesthetics isn't just about these visual elements. It's about that which goes into making people feel alive, whether it's going back to my analogy about great food and great wine and great fragrance, great sound. I mean, to this day, as good as the best sound systems are, there's nothing that's better than a great concert hall when it comes to the richness of a live orchestra. And as great as the best cameras are, there's nothing that's better than the human eye when it comes to looking at a magnificent scene, whether it's at the base of a mountain or looking at the ocean. And we as humans are not using that advantage nearly enough. So this is why I call it the other AI. It may be the only advantage we have left.
One of the most interesting things that we've learned over the last 9 months in retail is, number one, how resilient the consumer has become. But number two, how adaptive to our necessities and lifestyle we've also become. When you think about what's going on, sure, there's a lot of talk about people changing their spending habits and buying the essentials during the hoarding period with the sanitary products, the paper goods, the home office setup. That was the early stage of the lifestyle change that we saw, and we started hoarding food and groceries and things like that. And we altered our spend, but what hasn't gotten a lot of play has been the shift in what we call the discretionary divergence. The discretionary divergence. And what I would mean by that is we've gone away from buying experiential, which has been the long-term trend over the last few years. We were doing a lot of experiential spending on travel. Think about all of the people that were out there traveling without regard, in many cases, for funds or locations. And what they were doing was they were, going out for that selfie moment to share with all of their friends on social media that, capture that great photograph in front of some national treasure somewhere in. And what has now happened has been this shift from that. We're not dining out as much. We're not going on cruises. We're not spending in the US $50 billion on an annual basis on ticket sales to things like movies, concerts, sporting events, the theater. That's $50 billion that we're not spending. So when you add it all up and you have well over $200 billion that the consumer's not spending, that experiential spend has now been transformed into tangible items, discretionary items. So that's what you're now seeing, and that is continuing on and will likely continue on into holiday. So yeah, sure, we're all buying more pajamas and slippers and cozy bottoms and stretch pants, and we're buying more activewear, and we're buying more of the athletic equipment. We're even buying more toys, TVs, and cell phones to entertain ourselves differently. We're doing home office setups, and we're doing home cooking. So all of those lifestyle changes that are focused on the home, focused on the home office, focused on home learning, all right, and focused on healthier lifestyle, all of the spending that we're now doing is elevating retail sales. So things have gotten better in some industries and have just been taken apart in others. The fashion industry has been obviously the hardest hit. The beauty industry and the accessory industry have really taken it on the chin the most. The apparel business, well, there were periods there where we saw basic selling. We saw the underwear business, the intimate business, obviously the pajama business, even the jean business during the Father's Day period actually accelerated into some growth mode. The swimwear business did well as the weather changed, as people tried to find ways to entertain more outside. And that's why you saw and heard about all these swimming pools that you could no longer get on a short-term basis. So what is happening is this shift in spending has created a very different demand. One of the things that's driving that, besides the whole lockdown and stay-at-home lifestyle, which has been softening, has been the transition of where we're working, if we're working, and how we're working remote, and working in the suburban and rural communities has just dramatically changed the demand for apparel, the demand for fashion. So the 60% declines year over year sales that we were seeing in beauty, accessories, and fashion and footwear, all of those actually were cut in half over a 4-week period of time. So by the end of May, we saw a beginning to the road to recovery. And in some cases, we're now only down to 10% to 15% declines in those same fashion industries over the last couple of weeks. So things have gotten better. Will they continue to, rise to the last year levels? Well, not necessarily until we see the return to socialization, that social progression, and the return to the workplace. Those are the two things that are driving the majority of the transition in the fashion industry. Now, let's think about how we're spending our money as we look, a little bit more towards the future for fashion. And you begin to get into the element of starting to recognize that the consumer is spending within those 4 towers of lifestyle changes: the work at home, the educated home, the healthier lifestyle, all right? and certainly the ability to be able to entertain within the home. How are we going to entertain ourselves, entertain our kids, entertain our family? And that's causing a shift in spending. Home improvement is just skyrocketing with growth. When we look at small domestic appliances, how would you like to have your business growing over the last few months on average of over 35% a week? All right, that's just the average. There have been weeks where they've grown 60%. All right, over Prime days, just 2 weeks ago, we saw a growth level of 100% growth over last year's numbers. Now, consider the fact that Prime Day this year wasn't against Prime days from back in July last year. That allowed it to be that big of a growth rate. But when you think about what's going on, we are seeing dramatic shifts in how and what we're spending. And that's causing the ability to be able to now have to rethink the equation as we look forward into the future. So before we go down the future road, let's just look at what else is going on in the market right now. And that has a lot to do with how we're living our lives and what we're going to be focused on. So to me, one of the most interesting things is, besides the urban migration, there is 25% of those that are 40 years of age or younger living in the cities with kids. That's 25% of those that are 40 years of age and younger with kids living in the cities have migrated out of the city. And that transition is really something that we have to watch. We literally look at GPS data to see when is the return to the workplace, when is the return to the urban dweller, when is the return to working back in the city. With all of this remote working that's going on and people now moving out, that's transitioning. We dress very differently when we're not cosmopolitan. We dress very differently than when we're not working. We entertain differently. We certainly dine differently. All right, now think about the equation, which is how we're living at home. The focus on the kitchen, the focus on small appliances, the focus on entertainment products, the ability to be able to sit there and recognize how our consumers going to live their lives go forward. It's not going to be that dramatically different than how we've just lived through the last 7 months during the COVID crisis, all right? So what does that mean? That means that this focus on how we move from, in half of the country, we're going to be moving back inside again because the seasons have changed. It's gotten colder. It's getting darker out earlier. So now all of a sudden that migration outward that we saw during COVID into the summer is now migrating back. How are we going to spend our money? Where are the consumers prioritizing it? When you look at how do we play into 2021, how are things going to play forward? And the big thing is everybody's sitting there. A lot of the brands and the manufacturers that I speak to and the retailers even are telling me, well, we're not going to look at 2020. We're going to go back to 2019 and try to use that as our litmus to be able to sit there and tell us how we have to plan to go forward. And I challenge that thinking to some degree. Yes, you have to look at 2019. But you also have to look at 2020 to some degree. Why? Because there are some lifestyle trends that are going to carry forward. So one thing that I explained to my retail and brand partners are to think about how to forecast 2021 with a very different lens than you've looked at before.
Hey guys, I'm Sydney Morgan Petro. I'm the head of retail and buying at WGSN in North America. And I'm really excited to speak to you guys today about the lessons that we can learn from this global pandemic, how it's already shifted consumer drivers and how we think it's going to continue to shift consumer drivers in the future and change product categories for women's wear in the future. So there's plenty of opportunities still out there from a fashion perspective if you know where to look. But first off, I want to run you through a bit of the methodology that we use at WGSN when assessing these trends. So forecasting has changed a lot in the past 5 years, and rather rapidly so, with the biggest shift coming from these new data sets. So it's giving us more and more intelligence every single day into consumer demand, their preferences, and their buying behaviors. So this slide is a really great summary of the top resources that we use when we're putting together a retail analysis report. And we have a whole additional set of consumer intelligence and demographic and political drivers that go into our macro forecast. But for this, I'll focus more on the main components that impact our retail reporting. So you'll notice on the top, those 5 components are mostly within the qualitative range. And these have really been the mainstays of forecasting for about the past 20 years. The exception, of course, being social media, which is much more recent. So you have your retail comp shopping, where we go out and we cover in-store shooting globally, and we do the e-commerce messages and the e-commerce merchandising. Then you have your global catwalk coverage, and then we see how that kind of trickles down to impact retail. We have our global trade shows that we cover, street styles and festivals around the world, and of course, social media influencers to note. But the bottom row is what's really evolved forecasting over the past 5 years. And this is the addition of all the quantitative components, all of the data sets. So at WGSN, we have 4 proprietary data sets that we use for the retail reports. We have InStock, which analyzes our e-commerce retail data. We also have Catwalk Analytics that literally tallies each and every piece of clothing that goes down a runway across the big 4 fashion weeks around the world. We have WGSN Barometer, which is our consumer sentiment tool. And this takes a daily dashboard of surveys to gauge brand perception and brand affinity. And then lastly, we also have our own social media data that scrapes hundreds of influencer accounts on a daily basis. And we wrap that up with public-facing information from Google Search Trends to really give that consumer perspective into what they're looking for online. So now we can delve into the juicy bits that have covered the methodology a little bit. So what has actually changed for the consumer amidst the pandemic? And how has it changed what she buys? So we can see right off the bat by looking at the data that at the start of lockdown, consumers were flocking online because the stores were closed. And this accelerated the adoption of e-commerce beyond what would have normally taken place in 2020. So e-com adoption really spiked across all demographics. But interestingly, we saw online visits increasing the fastest with women ages 55 to 74. So this definitely shows a new opportunity for women in that Missy or classic consumer space who are often overlooked and underserved. We also saw through our barometer data that women over 45 years of age are also changing why they buy. So an increasing end use for products is shifting towards exercising and at-home activity. And that again signals a white space opportunity for activewear and for hybrid loungewear in this market segment. We also saw that consumers were spending more money online at the start of COVID, but they were purchasing less frequently. So it really cements that idea that consumers were looking for more bang for their buck and investing in that fewer, better things mantra that we've really been talking about for a few seasons now at WGSN. So the home hub, the biggest shift that we've seen for the female consumer amid the pandemic is the adoption of the home hub. So this is a macro trend actually that we forecast for 2021, back in 2019, which has been rapidly accelerated by COVID-19. So essentially, the home must now be so many more things. It's now where we work, where we teach our children. We use it as a gym. We need to relax there. We need to sleep there. So much more than it was just a year ago. So looking at the new consumer drivers, this term 2-mile wear is something that we've been talking about at WGSN again for a couple of years, but it's been accelerated by COVID. And essentially, this is the idea of the clothes that you would wear within the 2-mile radius of your home. So they're things that are comfortable enough to, work from home on the couch and just be lazy, but smart enough that you wouldn't be embarrassed to run into someone at the drugstore. So we've been tracking these shifts in consumer demand and product levels since pre-COVID, but when the stores closed and we couldn't resume our usual in-store shooting, the focus for our retail reports became much more on e-commerce and the analytical capabilities that we had around e-commerce. So these are some of the summer retail report findings where we sussed out, exactly which categories and items were performing well at online retail. So as you can see, sleepwear, activewear, and lingerie had markdowns well below the apparel average, showing better performance than categories that were highly discounted, like your jumpsuits and your dresses and your skirts. So this kind of set the mood for the season. And then looking at our full price out of stocks, you can see which particular bottom weight styles were selling out, with the jogger and the legging leading, but showing essentially anything with a drawstring or a loose fit was performing very well. And we did see this even segue into denim qualities later in the year. So essentially anything loungewear related was still performing well, from robes to slippers to cardigans. And as we mentioned before, the home has now become synonymous with the gym. And you can see from our social media data that back when the state of emergency was announced in March, the mentions of #comfort and #home workouts saw a huge surge year on year across Europe and the US. And seeing that's where many of our female shoppers are getting their outfit inspirations from, brands that were smart quickly adapted their merchandising messages to be more comfort centric. And that's really one of the easiest things to have done at the start of the pandemic, which was also something that we saw a lot of retailers failing to do. And that was to use e-commerce and your email blasts and your social media to immediately reframe the assortments to align with the new realities that consumers were facing. And because both lounging and workouts are happening in the same location now, this emphasis on exercise to every day is really paramount. Product must have multiple end uses, and it must create solutions. Clothing for clothing's sake is just not a priority at the moment. And then unsurprisingly, we also tracked sneakers as one of the footwear categories that performed really well year on year, but not just any sneakers performed well. So styles had to be adaptable, technical, waterproof, sporty, etc. Those saw the lowest average markdowns. Essentially, fancy failed. Chunky sneakers, embellished sneakers, glitter sneakers all saw very high discounts. So you can see that initially this shift towards the home hub meant that most categories were suffering outside of lounge and activewear. But we all know that the consumer is going to reach the sweatpant fatigue after a while, and we're already kind of starting to see that. So they need to know what's next. What will women want? So in the fall, when we looked again at the online retail data, we started noticing a shift in categories that were adding comfort properties to their product descriptions. And year on year, we saw a surge in relaxed and comfort tailoring. We also saw a lot of knit and jersey items taking on previously woven silhouettes. We're seeing a boom in sweater sets and these kind of new leisure suits that add a very luxe quality to loungewear and injecting a lot of room for newness. And this is definitely something that we saw coming off of the catwalks as well. Right now, the European high street brands are doing a really, really good job at picking up on this. So I expect to see it impact the US market much more in the coming seasons. So we're looking also at a softer take on suiting to impact career wear for autumn winter 21, which has taken a big hit. Around the office, we're dubbing it work leisure. And this image on the top right is actually the cover image from our work leisure design capsule for autumn winter 21. So this is a personal favorite of mine. We're seeing that consumers spending more time at home, the Victory Garden is returning. So this checks a lot of boxes for the COVID age consumer: sustainability, as well as wellness and improved mental health, kind of a respite from the monotony of life inside the home. It can be a social media, humble brag, and it's really just an overall aesthetic. For youth in particular, we really saw this coming from the hashtag cottagecore, which stemmed from TikTok culture. But it's really grown into its own very kind of magical and mystical world across social media channels. And it gives us this sort of escapist reality, which actually feels very timely right now. This trend has a lot of legs, though, beyond just youth. It evolves those prairie and those boho themes that are pretty much perennial commercial themes across women's wear. So you can extend it even into contemporary women's wear and even to the Missy consumer. So we're looking at key items like the ditzy floral dress, which is a very kind of Laura Ashley throwback look, the wide brim sun hat, and the big frilly sweaters with puff sleeves, things like that. But it's not all super frivolous. So simultaneously, we're seeing a movement towards more practical items within this space arise. At the office, we're calling it horticool for now, but this may change. Essentially, it's mixing in these fun patterns and colors onto waterproof clogs and gardening wellies and your wax cotton jackets. So it all kind of works together to create this very, garden meadow aesthetic. We're seeing a lot of gardening friendly brands in the footwear space, like Crocs and Birkenstock, performing really, really well throughout the year. So we noted that their markdowns were much less than the market average from June through September. And these brands have both been doing a ton of collaborations. So they're making sure that they keep their social media buzz very strong while also maintaining their commercial base. Both of these brands have been doing a lot of collaborations as well. So they're making sure that they maintain that social media buzz while also keeping their strong commercial base. So we can see here from the data that the social media mentions of hashtag backyards were up year on year with influencers, while mentions of vacations went way down. So it kind of cements that idea of the staycation as being a really important theme for the season. So as I mentioned before, sweatpant fatigue is real. And for many, back to work has already begun or will begin shortly. So what other opportunities are out there arising in women's wear that we should be paying attention to? Reemergence. So we're going to be reemerging into the world, and it's going to bring about a lot of new concerns, and with that, potential solutions. So this is really a great time for product development, as consumers are looking for solution-oriented products that will make their lives easier. So we're seeing a lot of new hybrid categories emerge. Almost everything in the apparel space is now being infused with technical properties. And really shouting about these benefits will go far to get the consumer's attention. So we've all noticed that this flood of direct-to-consumer brands that's been coming in and disrupting the retail space over the past 5 years, they all really have one thing in common, and that's that they clear the clutter for the consumer. They make that path to purchase easier by offering the best product versus the biggest assortment. That is, of course, unless you're Amazon, which is not what we're talking about here. So this is really a great model to follow for smaller brands that are looking to differentiate. So back at the start of the pandemic, we wrote a report on the new commute, and this is focusing on how metropolitan consumers will get back to work whenever they do return. So right now we're in the midst of a bicycle boom. They're selling out all around the world. But we're also seeing major cities investing in commuter lanes and pedestrian walkways at a pace not seen before. So this really means that the infrastructure is being put in place to make pedestrian and cycling lifestyles a lot more available to consumers than ever before. So this is definitely a trend to keep an eye on as we look further towards the future. There's a lot of design opportunities here. So one that I always like to call out, because we haven't talked about it in a long time, is the return of the skort. So items that are very versatile. As you can see, it actually had quite a big surge on Google search year on year back in April. But we're also seeing a rise in mentions of bike or cycle in product descriptions online for essentially every women's category out there. So this is a great move on for athleisure themes, which we know has begun to stagnate for a while now. And it also moves on your career wear. So commuter clothing is a great opportunity. And you can also look towards commuter bags that can go from the bike to the boardroom, and tech enhanced suiting that offers moisture wicking or four-way stretch or gussets for movability. And that's something we're seeing a lot more of in the menswear space at the moment, but I do expect this to move into women's wear later on. So kind of going hand in hand with the commuter trend is a focus on weatherproofing. And again, this is something that we're already beginning to see in our key items like this fall's must-have chunky Chelsea boot that's absolutely everywhere. But expect these properties to become more of a focus on jackets and trousers and other categories going forward. Ministry of Supply I pulled out here. It's a great brand to watch for their very kind of technical career apparel and commuter apparel. We also see a confirmation here from the data that rain boots and Chelsea boots are dramatically increasing new wins across online assortments, showing that retailers are really feeling strongly and backing this trend as well. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about the mask opportunity, because you can't talk about COVID consumer without talking about masks. So we've been tracking the demand, via Google search and the stockists via WGSN InStock since the beginning of spring. And we've seen the move kind of go from urgent health concern to more fashion related terms across Google search over the past few months. Expect this also to move into the commodity space for face masks. So this is something that we started tracking around May, that they were going from individual packs into multi-packs. So again, getting a little more bang for your buck. Retailers are getting a little bit smarter as production ramps up. So currently, the majority of masks are being marketed towards women. So that does show opportunities for new markets, much less saturation right now across men's and kids for masks, but I'm sure that will not last very long. We're also seeing printed masks beginning to outpace solids. So that's where you can really leverage your dead stock materials. And I particularly love this image from Reformation where it's print matched to her dress. And that was actually an aesthetic trend that we saw coming off of the runways a couple seasons ago that we've been tracking, and that I think will be accelerated by brands leveraging their dead stock to match the apparel. So also think about the add-on opportunities that can come with masks. And this is covers items like sanitizing solutions. So Stony Clover Lane, which is the image I pulled out here, they have a kit that offers a storage bag, and it comes with a custom hand sanitizer. So we're also seeing a lot of silicone antibacterial holsters, and those are really great for the youth market, along with mask lanyards and decorations with beads and pearls. So it's more of a street style element or youth or fast fashion, but definitely something to kind of move it on from such a commodity item into more of a fashion piece for down the road. So that's just a little taste of the consumer trends and shifts that we've been tracking, backed up with the data, and a few idea starters on white space opportunities to design into for your future seasons. So thank you very much, and please reach out if you have any questions at all.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carl Haller. I'm a partner with IBM's Global Services Consulting Organization. And prior to joining IBM a few years ago, I've spent most of my career in the apparel and fashion industry, working at a variety of brands, including The Limited in Columbus. What I really want to talk to you today is about how retailers and brands are using new tools in AI and analytics to solve an age-old challenge, or really to tackle an age-old challenge, which is how to understand consumer demand at the micro and the macro level far enough ahead of time so you can react to it and get the right product at the right place at the right time at the right price. It's what we've been trying to, dozens of years in this industry, and understanding what consumers will want 9 to 12 months in advance, determining how much to invest in a given collection, a given style, a given fabrication or color, and knowing when and where to allocate and flow those goods. This has been at the crux of a merchant's challenge as long as I've been in the industry. And it's one that's really only been exacerbated by COVID. We look here and we see, 3 points in time that the New York Times had highlighted last week. And you can see how, COVID cases have really swept, starting in pockets back in April, swept across the South, swept across the Midwest. And what we're expecting through this year and into next year are continued disruptions at the local level on the demand side that we have to react to. Historically, we've always tolerated some level of bumpiness in the business, day to day, week to week, store by store. It is retail after all. There's always going to be some variation. Over the last 6 months, however, as we've seen the outbreak spread across the country, many, if not all, almost all apparel stores have had to close. Almost everyone has had to adjust their operating policies, and we've seen consumer behavior shift dramatically. Some of these shifts may be permanent, and what were once minor bumps in the business have become real spikes and troughs in demand that have to be addressed. And it's not an easy challenge to address. It really requires understanding certain data and insights at multiple steps throughout the process, whether it's understanding something, 9 to 12 months in advance, or understanding specific quantities and style, color, size variations, maybe 4 to 8 months in advance, and understanding where to flow goods. All of these decisions take place months before when the consumer is actually going to touch the product. Not to mention it's complicated by what we do in season, either replenishing goods back to stores or even chasing goods back from manufacturing, flowing back through. Further complicated by trying to bring insights and feedback from consumers at every stage of the process. And we have to do this multiple times a year. Maybe it's 4 times because it's a seasonal collection. Maybe it's even 6, 8, or 12. And if we talk about, the old view of floor sets, it's happening virtually all the time. And many of these overlap. So there's a lot of complexity in the business. What I want to talk to you about is 2 areas. The first, which is what you see here, is to make more of the data that you have. There's a lot of data that retailers and brands have existing in their merchandising systems and also in e-com and other systems that we believe you're able to leverage to get a better view on what demand is going to be going forward. One of these is really looking at the products that you have at the attribute-based level and starting to drive your demand forecasts off of that. So we've all got products. They all have attributes. Some of these are specifically listed in the merchandising systems or in the PLM tool. Some of them sit in tech packs. Some of them sit in the e-com systems. Some of them we have to extract using computer vision and visual recognition to understand the item and then to see that the red and white stripe pattern. Or maybe we're picking something up from a natural language text search of the written description that sits on the website. But we can use those to break down an item into its underlying component parts and then run forecasts off of how similar attributes have performed in the past, which gives us an additional level of detail to understand why something is selling well or why something is selling not well. Let me show you a quick example. So here you can see this is a sample. It's an actual product. It's sample data of why this item had sold in the spring season. I'm going to zoom in quickly here. You can see the attributes. If I can zoom, oops, let me see if my zoom is working. So you can see here that there were a number of attributes that drove the sell-through rate up, notably the off-shoulder neckline and the crop length. price was something that drove the sell-through down slightly, and this is a 4-week sell-through, by the way. If then we can see that and make decisions off of it, it's also interesting that when we look at the same item in the fall season, but here you see the neckline, which actually drove sell-through rate up in the spring, actually contributed to sell-through rate declining in the fall. So you always have to take a seasonal view of this. What you can do then when you start to understand these things is you compare this item against other products in the same category with different, in this case, necklines. So you can see here, if we change the neckline to a different neckline, which ones would actually potentially contribute to a better sell-through versus a slightly lower sell-through. And you can see there are a couple here, the crew neck and the U-neck there. You can see those actually contributed toward a slightly higher sell-through than the off-shoulder. Pretty much everything else was flat. Now, this is not making the decision, but this is giving additional insight that, that merchants and design teams can use to help make future product decisions. Another aspect of this, and this is an age-old problem, when you're replacing maybe 50, 70% of your assortment on a seasonal basis, the most common way that I've seen to predict the demand is to twin that item against a similar item in a prior collection. That's usually a manual process, somewhat time-intensive, and it usually requires someone with a lot of historical knowledge understanding what the assortment was and saying, hey, you know what, this T-shirt looked like this shirt we did 3 seasons ago. Well, what we've done is used a computer vision and a visual search algorithm to identify similar looking items. You can see here, in this example, it goes back 4 prior seasons, and you can get 6 similar items from each season. And what you see in the slight bar that goes across is what the sell-through rate was of those given items. So this greatly speeds the ability of a design team or a merchant team or a planning team to go through and look at how that item might perform and then find the right model to pair that against to look at what the future demand might be for that new item. And these are just a few of the data sources that you can look at. You can take all of this and you can bounce it against the customer file if you have good segmentation of your customer data, and you can look at how given items performed within given customer segments. You can also look the same thing, and what you see on this page is how items have performed at the store level with a geographic overlay, so you can actually look at neighborhoods or metropolitan areas and see how those items perform. There's also other data that we can take advantage of, email or contact center inquiries, feedback from consumer panels, some of the actions that we've taken place throughout the year, either in marketing and or visual merchandising, that would have contributed toward higher or lower sell-through, and even pricing and promotional activity. So in aggregate, there's a lot of data that we have that we can combine together to help make better forecasting decisions for a future season. But usually even that is not enough. And where we have found a big difference is incorporating external data and insights into the mix. And this is another area where there's a lot of data that's out there, and the real effort is figuring out which data to look at. This is kind of our standard view of the data wheel, where you've got things around stores, the economy, product attributes, which we've already talked about, competitor actions, local events and or social media, brand and news trends, and something which I'll go into in a second around COVID-19 and the spread of the pandemic. But this is really, and what our data scientists find is that adding external data usually makes the biggest difference in future forecast accuracy, especially if we're talking about a less than 6-month time period where we've got actually decent forecast data. One of these, we all know weather is a significant driver of consumer sentiment and consumer behavior. In this example, we've actually started to quantify that. And what I find interesting about this is, one, the amount of weather impact varies greatly by the type of weather activity we're talking about. So here in this example, you can see that it was the temperature forecast that drove a third of the variation in sales performance, where the actual temperature only drove 12%. A sunny day, in this case, actually potentially reduced sales by up to 40%. Some of that is at the product demand level. Some of that is actually at the traffic level. This was an example that we did a couple of years ago with an outdoor apparel brand, and weather, you could use the weather to explain 75% of the variation in sales. And you say, okay, that's an outdoor apparel brand. So, okay, my brand is not going to be different. Maybe I'm in the ready-to-wear business. But maybe you could explain a third. Maybe it's half. Maybe it's 25%. And I think we'd still want to know, that could be the difference between, say, +5 and +3, or the difference between -2 and -3. And being able to understand that weather and which weather is driving the demand can really help understand what to actually do about it, and whether that's something we can do on the product side, or whether that's actually an action that we need to take place in terms of pricing, in terms of promotion, in terms of signage, in terms of customer outreach, et cetera. Another part of external data, and this really spans kind of internal and external, most brands that we work with have a customer file. They have customer segments. Typically, they have multiple customer segments, but far fewer are able to really integrate all of their different data sources, the internal data sources they have, and then there are still a lot of external data sources that we believe that we believe brands can be tapping into. So kind of on the left is where we see most brands taking advantage of their data to better understand demand. Again, as I mentioned before, there are some of these things in the middle where there's data that exists in the company, but that we're not blending into the overall customer file. And then there are some areas which we've not always fully tapped into. Understanding the personality profiles of our customers, understanding whether our target customer segments represent a large or small portion of the population in a given market, understanding the actual share of wallet, understanding trends in location and mobility, understanding the actual things that might drive a given consumer to behave in a given way, and being able to execute that at scale. So to actually have, being able to take a triggered action and pick out, the 500,000 people out of the 10 million people in the file to take a given action against, whatever action that may be, whether it's a marketing action or a pricing or promotional action or an outreach action. One of these external data sources is looking at social media. This has been experimented with a lot. We have done this for a handful of clients where we've started to look at multiple products, looked at customers and influencers of what people were saying on social, and looking at history. And for this client, we were actually able to predict a downtrend in an item. It was a jumpsuit item. This was a couple of years ago, versus where their sales forecast was taking it, because most of the sales forecasts just kind of keep building something forever and don't really take into account, seasonality or trend in as big of a way. So the black line at the bottom is when we adjusted their sales forecast based on what we were seeing in social, on Instagram in particular, we were able to help them take actions, mark things down ahead of time. If they could stop product, they can stop product, but if they can't, they can actually take action ahead of time to mark something down where they can sell it at, maybe 25 off versus 40 off, or, dreaded 70 off. Another thing that all retailers, especially in this day and age, should be keeping an eye on is mobility. the actual movement of people in the marketplace. And this is something that has been evolving greatly. We track this on a daily basis, and it's something that just in 2 data points, you can see back on April 1st, the country was largely shut down. Almost everywhere was, the mobility of consumers was down about 50%, or almost up to 50%. Except for some of the pockets that had the COVID outbreaks where the mobility was down 50 to 100%. Now when we look out, this was one I pulled from the end of August, we've got a whole patchwork going on out here. There are certain parts of the country where mobility is in fact trending higher, much higher than it was last year. And there are other pockets where mobility is trending down 50 to 100% still versus what it was last year. This is not a time where we can run with our normal store clustering models or our normal, ABCD store models. This is a time where we actually have to understand, to be able to predict demand, we need to know what's going on at a city-by-city, county-by-county basis. Similarly, mobility is one of those factors that feeds into kind of what we call the pandemic disruption. Pandemic cases, obviously, would be another one. But we have built an index that looks forward, I believe, 45 days to understand the economic expression of the disruption of COVID-19. It could be any pandemic, but right now it's COVID-19 at a county-by-county level. This is on a logarithmic scale, going from less than 1 up to 7. So each one is 10 times worse than the one before. Given that we are talking about Columbus retail, I did try to zoom in a little bit there. This is Franklin County. And Franklin County is about the same right now. It was at a 4.2 a month ago, and then last week, at a 4.3. So not too much happening differently, at least in Franklin County. But you can see, Hamilton County actually has ticked darker 1 notch in red from where it was 1 month ago. Just thinking about some of the major population areas of Columbus, and then up, I don't remember the county, but the county that's just south of Toledo, where Bowling Green is, has also ticked 1 notch darker in red from a month ago. So again, those things are all driving demand patterns for stores that we have in that market. And this in general, the pandemic is making us think about things at the local and neighborhood level in a way that we haven't before. But really, that's the way we need to be thinking about and running the business now. We need to understand kind of what I'll call the static characteristics of a neighborhood and then the dynamic characteristics of a neighborhood. On the static side is kind of what you see here, which is, we understand in general certain styles may work better or worse in certain markets. When I was in the business, at Brooks Brothers in particular, there were certain styles, we were a Northeast-based brand, certain styles just wouldn't sell in Southern California. It wasn't even as much a fabrication, it looked like the Northeast, it didn't fit with that lifestyle. So understanding those things, understanding the customer characteristics at the local level, even getting into, are there offices, schools, churches, are there new housing developments that are going in that are happening? What's happening with the overall population? Those are some of the macro things that happen. What's our competitive intensity? What's our relative brand strength in a market? And then you've got all of the stuff that overlays day by day, week by week. Another thing that I always like to look at is, what's happening with sports? Now, this will be relevant again when they're kind of our sports that we're going to, but thinking about the dynamics, I'm from Columbus, as I mentioned, so I understand the difference between a home Saturday and an away Saturday for Ohio State. That probably drives, beer and hot dog demand slightly more than it drives apparel demand, but it does drive apparel demand. And then you think about that and you explode that across all of the major colleges and universities. Then you think about all of the pro sports. If you're in certain markets, you think about all of the high school sports. You think about theater events. You think about weather events. You think about traffic disruptions. Each of those things are having an impact, maybe only a minor impact at the individual level, but in aggregate, having potentially a major impact. And the goal of this, and I'll admit this is a very easy to look at demo. The goal is that we always accept, without having the external insight. On the left, you see there's always a variability in the actuals and the forecast. And this is just a couple of example products. The goal with adding in this external data is to reduce that amount of variability, down to maybe 100 basis points, 150 basis points. For people who look at MAPE, we've seen places where we've improved MAPE, the mean average percent error in a forecast from the upper 20s to mid 30s, sometimes down as low as single digits in terms of forecast accuracy. The closer in you get, the better you can get. For that. But we've seen this addition of external data greatly improves the level of forecast accuracy.
I'm Kat DePizzo. I'm the Vice President of Design for Justice.
And I'm Julia Hanna, the Vice President of Merchandising for Justice. And thank you for having us. It's great to be here. So our brand, Justice, is focused on the tween girl, so really ages 6 through 12. But we have a sweet spot of really that 10 to 12-year-old. So, actually we capture her for a very short amount of time. There are very few 6 to 12-year-old girls in America. And so, it's really important, I think, for Kat and I to focus on the 10-year-old as our core customer, but the aspiration, like she looks up to the 16-year-old. We're not trying to make her 16, but the fashion that she sees on her big sister and friends, we want to make sure she's getting it in the appropriate way. But it's also really interesting. Justice is a very interesting business model because you need to acquire young customers that can stay with the brand for 3 to 4 years, right? So how do you introduce categories that will bring a 5 and 6-year-old into the business, like toys and plush animals, and that she has something she can get before she can actually fit into the clothes that start at size 6, and then really the clothes and are really more the aspirational side for the older girl.
Yeah, there's a certain magic to what we do, which is so fun. People always, will say, "Oh, well, you do kids wear." No, I don't even think about it like that, at all. That's not the focus. We really do create really magic for an emotion for the girl of something. It has to be something that she can't find anywhere else. And oh, by the way, she loves the brand name. So like the fact that it's Justice, right? That's means something to our customer. We have a every girl, every day slogan that we like to say, because that's our job, is to empower and support every girl every day and lift them up. And every interaction, every touch point with them should do that. That's our job. That's our magic.
Really the heart of what we do is concept to customer, building great, amazing concepts and figuring out ways and nuances to deliver them to our customers.
In a normal state, we would be shopping around the world and getting inspiration from aspirational brands and looking in every kind of nook and cranny for what's next, as well as looking at, competitors and just trying to understand what's coming down the pipeline and what's going to be important for, our girl and our customer for the next big season. And then we would put that all together. We would work with our vendors and we would get inspiration from their trends and what they were seeing from fabrics and development and all of that, and do a trend and concept for the season that we would map out. We would also purchase all of these samples. It was a very physical process where you're hands-on creating visuals and honestly very laboriously intensive and expensive.
A lot of what I love is actually being in stores with our customer, watching mom and girl shop, guardian and girl shop, whoever's in the store with her, and really truly understanding her behaviors and listening to the voice of the customer to influence the way that we're shaping trend and concept together. Everything turning virtual, her life changed overnight. Therefore, we had to change overnight, just not in how we work, but how we think about what she needs, what girl and mom need. People were losing jobs, market was unsure, things that, became priorities, food. But what's interesting about being in the tween market is kids grow, kids have needs, kids still, everyone got outside to play and be more with nature. So playwear became a lot more important and value became a lot more important.
And ironically, from just the trend and creative from that concept process in COVID, a flip of a dime, everything went digital. So we've been, researching via, certainly with some fashion services that do trend research, but really it's been the teams that scour, digitally and social media and all the things that are happening out there in the world, and we compile all that in, and we've been doing our trend and our even our color and direction completely digital. So what and how do you anticipate that for next year? How do you anticipate that for next season? To Julie's point, 8 to 10 months out, you really can't. And because none of us know, we have worked with amazing partners and our overseas vendors to shorten our cycle. In some cases, almost in half. And so thanks to so many people, we are best in class when it comes from a timeline on how fast we can get product to our girl. And that has been a huge game changer for us and in the industry. And I think that all retailers are going to have to consider, their timeline and how far they project out, their plan. And rather than working 10 to 12 months out, which many large retailers still do, you got to be more nimble and quick to be able to react.
We flipped to a digital first company. Storytelling has to change. Creative trend and concept changes. The speed to market changes. People's expectations of ordering to get them to her door changes. And so it's not even just about the product we offer, but how does a front table in a store, when you walk into a store and you see the front merchandising of a table come to life online, how do we start changing the storytelling so that mom and girl, when they're coming to the digital platform, understand our vision from the beginning? It's a different game.
And within days, we had mobilized our entire staff. Everybody was working from home completely remotely. We had all the product that we sent out for development shipped directly to my front door. So when I say that all the delivery people think I'm insane, and we're a little mad,
and our neighbors too,
and my neighbors, they definitely do. The doorbell would ring constantly and just stacks of boxes. So from around the world, our amazing vendors were shipping all the samples here. We had a makeshift, sample room in my garage, right? Rolling racks, the whole shebang. And it was, we just made it work. We were unpacking things. And the way that we started working together, instead of having these giant meetings where everybody would come in, is we were literally assorting the line in my driveway. So that's how we would do it. We would lay it out and take the date. We would look at the weather and be like, I think on this day, it's going to be sunny from these hours and warm enough-ish. I mean, truly, we're on ladders, like taking pictures and video and zooming people in and trying to show them what the collection looks like. And we had a full-on buy review in the driveway. So that was how we, assorted the product. And then those were back to school or in holiday, and the pieces go out and then they go off to a tech designer who's at home, who's going to fit it on a body form at home virtually, and then is going to work with their overseas vendor to do a virtual fitting. And actually, it worked out great. We've reduced our sampling by, it's insane. We're barely getting any samples made. The waste that we had before, let alone in paper and in supplies and samples, our footprint is just really changed of our, just from a sustainability standpoint and a cost. So, I like to say in all of this, there will be good things that come out of this for retail, right? Retail, I always say retail's a cockroach. It doesn't go away. It doesn't die. And, and I believe that there will be good things that come out of this, and that this has busted the corporate retail myth of this idea that you have to do all of these things.
Yeah.
And you don't. And we had to learn that for ourselves too. There were things that were sacred cows that we would hold on to in our process, and we don't. And we assorted and we developed and assorted an entire line completely virtually, soup to nuts.
We used to go into a buy review and buy for 12 to 16 weeks. That's not reality anymore. You need to buy yourself time to learn her behavior, learn mom's behavior. Is it digital or stores? We still have 2 different distribution centers, so all of our inventory is actually not in one place. So not only do we have to get the right product in the right size at the right time, but it also has to be at the right DC so that we can get it into the hands of the customer that wants it. So it's really complicated. And you need to ensure that you have the raw materials positioned overseas. They're not liabilities, they're actually your friend, right? Because you can, in partnership, we decide what raw materials we want to be in upfront. We can position where we think based on the water level of the business, give ourselves a 10-point swing and start chunking into the buys, get strikeoffs approved, get prints approved, get graphics approved, get color approved, and then go where the wind blows with the customer. So I'll give you an example. Last spring, in January, we have a collection called Everyday Favorites, and it's really grounded in playwear. So in the fall, it's leggings and long sleeves. In the spring, it's tanks and shorts. And we had a strategy to go into playwear over the summer, even before COVID. But when COVID hit, we knew her life was going to change. She's not going to need dresses. She's not going to need all those woven pretty tops that she's not going to play on the playground or outside. And so we shifted into playwear, into those tanks and shorts. And we learned in January and February what our customers' favorite choices were. And then we were able to speed into those choices for April, May, and June, into the right choices online.
And I think being able to, a lot of us grew up in the industry with a very big mindset around you test, you prove, you react, you test, you prove, you react. A lot of what I think, we're finding and that I believe retailers are going to need to do is have some conviction, right? And take some stands for some things, because you don't have time. And honestly, if you have the time, you're too late by the time you get it. So you got to know your customer really well. You got to stay close. That's way more important than just trying to come up with a plan with a strategy to test things. I'm not saying that, testing goes completely away, but in this environment, you got to be ready to hit now. And you really have to have that conviction.
And that's probably what keeps me the most fueled as a merchant and the most excited about my job is it's never boring. It's always changing. It always keeps you on your toes and it never stops.
We won't disappoint you. Meaning lies within you.
Thanks for watching, and join us for the next episode, Digital First.